You're a co-founder of Stand for Health Freedom, a really critical organizing tool around legislation and around candidates, and also founder of GreenMedInfo. And I know you've got a new thing that you're working on with others that's very exciting. So hopefully you'll tell us a little bit about it. And you're going to talk about key ideas here, germ theory and genetic determinism. So we're thrilled to have you.
Thank you. It's an honor. It really is. Thank you. Most of this notion that I'd like to introduce is just a byproduct of a series of, uh, little epiphanies I've had. But I've been tying it together over the years. In fact, in 2021, when I launched my book, Regenerate, I focused a lot on exosomes, which that was a word no one was really talking about. At one point, Andrew Kaufman and Dr. Cowan came to me and asked me what they are. And they ran with the whole notion that, there are no such things as viruses and they're just exosomes. And technically, that's not true. And if we're looking at the actual meaning of the word exosome versus other small particles that are emitted by cells in the range that are conventionally covering viruses. So let's say like 30 to 150 nanometers. There are other small particles that are emitted by cells continually, and those include things like apoptotic bodies when the cells are going through programmed cell death to be regenerated. It's a very beautiful Zen-like disassembly process, and those little bodies, and they're actually they get to be pretty big. They contain nucleic acids, just like conventional viruses and exosomes. And there's necrotic bodies, so if cells are damaged in a more, a less graceful fashion, they will produce what could be looked at and sometimes are indistinguishable from conventional viruses, especially if we're using very crude technology like PCR. Um, so there's this general discussion, and there's been a big battle, if you will, among those who are focused on the whole gain of function, weaponized particle narrative, which it's true, of course. There's been a multi-decade long Cold War of nation states creating as deadly a particle as they can conceive using all types of technologies, which of course we're all familiar with thanks to the mRNA um, campaigns. So there is that side of it. However, a truly lethal particle is very hard to produce without obviously including other toxicants and the extremely relevant nocebo effects of the fear that's induced in those who believe that there are these deadly particles. And then we start to get into almost medieval type of thinking around invisible, demons or spirits infecting people, and bone pointing, which is in the Aboriginal context, when a priest that's trusted in the tribe, points a bone at a tribe member and says, "You're afflicted, you're cursed, you're going to die." And because of the belief structure, which is reproduced in the clinical setting, of course, with the priests of the body, the men and women in the white coats, they end up going into the woods and they die the next day. And that was reproduced recently, a New England Journal of Medicine analysis of cancer diagnosis showed, based on 500,000 Swedes, that when they received a diagnosis of cancer, even though it could have been overdiagnosed, it doesn't mean that the diagnosis was true. Depending on the prognosis of that cancer, they had up to 26.9-fold increased risk of death from heart-related causes, meaning they were heartbroken. They were dealing with the grief of being basically pronounced dead by their conventional, priests of their body, and because they believed it, they succumbed, and so it's obviously a very powerful factor when it comes to the belief in invisible particles and being the number one thing that we're all told we have to be concerned about, of course, other than the ticking time bomb of the genes we inherited from distant ancestors based on a very archaic notion that there are protein coding genes in our body, the same that we share with earthworms, about 23,000, which of course, after the Human Genome project first draft was done in 2005, it was clear that this doesn't explain anything. You need at least 100,000 genes to, describe the 100,000 proteins within a single cell, much less the fact that you have the transcriptome or the RNAs, which the so-called junk DNA, right, transcribe, which is like an ocean of proteins that no one can comprehend because it's too complex, but that's what constitutes the structure and therefore function of human physiology, which is also why we need a human transcriptome project. So anyway, the point being that there's been a profound misunderstanding about what, we're supposed to be concerned about. It's not the genes, and it's definitely not germs in the sense of these invisible marauders that, are just vectors of morbidity and mortality. So, and of course, we know that on a superstructural level, we have seen an entire global governance system, assigned to itself this power non-democratically through the biosecurity state that they've tried to biopolitically, weaponize germ theory over so they could control everyone on this planet and, of course, manage populations, a euphemism for depopulation. So there's a lot riding on what we believe when it comes to germ theory and also terrain and what I propose to be a middle path, which is sometimes, well, at least what I've decided is to create a neologism called the Xenogen Hypothesis because it takes from xenohormetic and it takes from the word pathogen and tries to bring them together in a way that makes more sense, where people can start to understand how so-called viruses are vectors of resilience and that it does include exosomes, which are profound because they are these, nanoparticles about 40 to 130 nanometers that contain highly biologically active nucleic acids, including microRNAs, which despite they sound small, they are and irrelevant, but they actually supervene and help to control the expression of the majority of the protein coding genes in the human body. So microRNAs, they actually do a lot of silencing of gene expression. They're very powerful. In fact, that is why we have the mRNA platforms being deployed across, genetically modified foods, obviously the whole vaccine space, and of course now they're merging because of the fact that they're trying to do the replicating, self-spreading antigens and edible vaccines, etc. So they're very powerful. And it turns out all our cells produce them. Every living thing produces exosomes, and they are messengers of cross-kingdom communication, which is profound because it helps explain some of the amazing things in nature, in terms of the biomechanics of information transfer and coevolution. Like why does a, butterfly have the same exact patterns on its wings as the plant that it lands on? There's just this incredible beauty in the way that nature has unfolded. Of course, it's beyond comprehension, but at least we know now how a fungi can communicate directly to a human. And this is based on the study by Zhang in 2012 now, where they fed participants rice, and they basically found that the exosomes could contain these microRNAs, went into their digestion, survived digestion, went into their blood, and then modulated the LDL receptor in the liver, showing that there's profound effects to consuming foods, right? Food as medicine, well, food as information is really the way of understanding it. And I know I'm going all over the place, so I apologize, but I'll try to make this more simple. Essentially, let me just look at my notes, actually, maybe that'll help me, is that we have this notion that, contagion is a thing. People know they have families where someone gets sick, and then one individual happens to get the same symptoms and another individual is completely immune. We know exposure does not equate to infection, right? Just like, vaccination does not equate to immunity. But there is contagion, and the people on the no virus camp side will deny this. And yet everyone who's a parent, especially mothers taking care of children, know that there is something that looks like contagion. And what is that? Well, it's the same thing that was observed with herd immunity. There are periodic symptoms that emerge within groups of, a species, the individuals within a species. And essentially, what I understand is going on is that there are detoxification and resilience programs, if you will, because exosomes really are like software to the hardware of the body. And essentially, when detoxification is required, or there is a stressor in the environment, i.e., pollutions, non-native VMF, etc., or maybe the media environment that everyone has to lock down using prison terminology. There's an active shooter about, but it happens to be a virus from China, right? Is that's so stressful. When you have xenohermetic exposures, it's similar to why plants produce polyphenols, like resveratrol, curcumin, catechins in green tea. When an animal consumes them, they get the xenohermetic benefit, which is they are able to activate pathways of resilience, detoxification, longevity that help them to prepare for imminent changes in the environment. That's part of the sort of co-evolutionary marvel of xenohormesis. That's why, again, we're using the word xenogen to describe what's actually going on when it comes to infection, is that the body is then, when faced with certain environmental adversity, engaging a set of detoxification mechanisms. Now, it's also known in the West as sickness syndrome, where the only time people get the excuse of not going to work, right, in industrial societies is, oh, I'm sick. Well, that's because her body finally just needs to stop eating. You need to stop socializing. You're not interested in sex. You go in your bed, you're just sitting there in malaise. You have these symptoms, which include fever. You might throw up. You might have diarrhea, influenza, for example. And those symptoms are detoxification symptoms, and they're helping you to compensate for a lifestyle that's unhealthy. And in fact, many people aren't healthy enough to even have these acute symptoms anymore. So they just end up dying, from either heart attack or they develop cancer. So these are expressions of health. And in the naturopathic tradition, we know that you nurture the symptoms. The symptoms aren't the disease, they're the mechanism by which your body heals and develops resilience and immunological resetting. What happens from the perspective of the easy water, which is what our cells are, right? We're 99% water molecule by number of molecules, is that when you elevate your temperature, you've actually made it easier to solubilize toxicants and excrete them. And that's actually found in the literature on exosomes, is that they actually contain compounds that are toxic to the body. Some of those are chemicals, some of them are actually misfolded proteins or nucleic acids that are no longer useful. Dr. Cowan sometimes described this as the cell pooping out things it doesn't need, so when that happens, of course, you end up transferring genetic information, which then another individual in that group, it could be your family, may need as software to engage the same detoxification pathways, which ultimately to resilience. And so they don't end up with cancer or, heart disease or heart attack. It's the same reason why we know there are health benefits to measles before they deployed the vaccine. You had a benefit for cardiovascular health as well as serious infections and cancer. There's trade-offs, obviously, when you suppress symptoms in that fashion. So there's a particle and a waveform simultaneously to all things. So although we can identify the exosome or so-called virus as the means by which the information is transferred from body to body, there's also an electromagnetic and scalar informational packet that is transferable. And when you really go deep into it, because of Luc Montagne's work, who I had the honor of meeting at Jerry Pollack's residence, is that you have even the possibility of teleportation and the manifestation, if you will, out of the biological ether, or call it the morphogenetic field, of particles that express certain types of information in physical form. So what I'm trying to communicate here is that if you're in a state of absolute stress, because the media just told you that there's a deadly particle, a new variant, and you really believe it, not only are you experiencing a cascade of physiological responses, but your body literally could manifest a particle that you could describe as a virus. So that's the crazy thing about here. What I'm talking about here is that the mind and the soul and the heart is so powerful that you could actually manifest the self-fulfilling prophecy of a conventional, so weaponized germ, theory. So there's complexity here. I know I went a little deep there, but I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of context for this discussion. So, so there's here. Let me share just a little bit for you here, so you can see. I've been doing some writing on the topic where there's one particular study, and I actually looks like I'm gonna have a hard time pulling that up right now. Sorry, but I'll just tell you what it is. It was a study that was done on Tylenol causing, and I can give you the links later. It's actually on my Substack. It's a 2018 study, and it was the effects of Tylenol-induced liver damage in mice. And what they found essentially was paradigm shifting, okay, in light of this new model. You know, essentially, is it poisoning or viral infectivity? Similar to the debate around polio and DDT exposure. This adds more complexity to it, though. What they found in this study was that when they exposed mice to a toxic dose of Tylenol, which is not hard to get there, as you know, it should be taken off the market. It's one of the most toxic chemicals that exists. Is that when they released, okay, so they gave the animals Tylenol and they released a large number of virus-like exosomes. And keep in mind, exosomes were originally described as virus-like particles because, again, they're practically, if not actually, indistinguishable from certain conventional viruses. So when these exosomes were then isolated and administered to healthy recipient mice, astonishingly, the exosomes alone, without exposure to the original drug, induced significant liver damage, increased in oxidative stress, inflammation signaling, and apoptosis in the recipients. So basically, you have what was observed to be a pseudo-infectious toxic effect from Tylenol-induced exosomes, which again would be from the outside in be perceived as conventional viruses. And
Sayer,
yeah.
I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I really understand that. So they gave Tylenol to certain mice.
Mhm.
Then did they harvest exosomes from those mice who were given Tylenol, and then they took those exosomes and exposed unexposed mice that had not been exposed to Tylenol or anything else to those exosomes, and then it induced. Is that what, do I have that right?
That's such a great question. Absolutely. Yeah, here's the actual paper. It's
So my
profound.
point is that then the mice that had not been exposed to Tylenol were only exposed to the exosomes of the Tylenol
Mhm.
exposed mice.
Got it.
And then the new group of mice developed the same
Same symptoms.
symptoms. Okay,
As
just
if,
want to make, so do
yeah,
I have that right?
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. So basically, that's the beauty of what we're seeing is that in this study, it reproduces other research, which is that when you have a toxicant exposure, and even through electromagnetic waveforms, this was done with COVID-19 particles and 5G actually on skin cells. They found that you could manifest a COVID-19 particle through EMF exposure. It's a highly controversial study at the time. Is that basically exosomes are produced as a cell stress response to toxic exposures, which is helpful because there's such a debate, isn't there, around whether, it's viruses or it's poisoning. And this is where we can go simpler on this topic, which I think is really helpful, is that most people think that they're sick because of, once again, viruses or germs. And it's the ultimate gaslighting that goes on in allopathy, right? Is there's infinite proof and infinite examples of exposures to highly toxic cell health and cell integrity destroying vectors. And instead of course, looking at the obvious, we're being told, no, it's idiopathic. We don't know what's causing it, or it's probably something genetic, and oh, it's probably one of the many new scariants we've devised, right, that you learn about on mainstream media. Not the obvious. But what's happening is that in this model, you understand how actually these chemicals do produce particles that could be described as infectious because they operate just like a conventional virus would. They seem to reproduce the effects of toxicant exposure, but through a particle that has a lipid bilayer membrane, has the exact same nucleic acids within it that you can say conventional viruses have, and that they seem to then participate in what looks like almost like contagion. I mean, you know what it's like to be around really toxic people, like the Christian Northrope style energy vampire to people that are just sick. They're at the gym, they're obese, they're just toxic, there's halitosis, and imagine what they're shedding. Shedding's a real thing, obviously. Those who got the jab were actually shedding semi-synthetic particles into, the auric field and the actual virome of those who didn't vaccinate. It was horrific. I mean, that's the problem with being a species. We all have to share in that kind of biological karma. So, so this is just part of what I'm trying to articulate. You can see why it was hard to put this on a series of slides. But one of the most amazing things, and I just did that this morning so I could be prepared for this talk, is when you do high intensity interval training and you are pushing a sled of 500 pounds and you're just dripping in sweat, the way you feel is like it's a living hell. The only other time I can think about how bad I feel is when I'm dealing with the type of influenza that actually I was delivered during the COVID window. It seemed like a very unique and very, very difficult type of virus that I was dealing with. And so the point here is that I don't generally get sick. I'm not susceptible to, episodic seasonal influenza, and nor are people that exercise intensely. Because one of the things that's happening here is I call it paleo restoration. You can look at it from the microbiome perspective, right? There is a thing called paleo restoration of the microbiome. You could consume raw honey. There's a lactobacillus strain in the midgut of the bee that's 86 million years old. It's been replicating within this protected biome and virome forever. And when you eat raw honey, you're restoring your microbiome to a state that literally is equivalent to what I call microbial time travel. So the similar thing applies when it comes to the fact that only until recently did we have the technology to control our environment through air conditioning and heating. So every day you went through periodic fluctuations in temperature, right? Nighttime would get cooler and midday was hot. And that is the way our bodies co-evolved with our environment from the time, we existed. And so what's happened is that when you're dealing with influenza, for example, you know how you're under the covers and you're like totally like super high fever, you're sweating and you're shivering inside. My understanding of this is the body's way of immunologically as well as phenomenologically resetting because of the deficiency of these natural cycles in our environment. And that's one way of understanding it, because we also know sweating is one of the best ways you can get out the petrochemicals and metals and plastics, etc., that have accumulated in the body. And those who are not undergoing those sorts of routine exercises and they're not experiencing the heat shock proteins, and then there's always cold plunge is another example. So if you do sauna and cold plunge, it's as if you're reproducing what your body will create in the form of influenza symptoms in the absence of the natural context that our body needs to be healthy. So that's a whole nother way of understanding influenza and understanding why some individuals actually really need to experience these acute symptoms, if you will, in order to reset and survive, because otherwise they will have a heart attack. There's so much sludge in their body they could barely, continue forward, or they're gonna have cancer. There's much more to it. Quick example. Exosomes, again, are like software or text messages. I had a friend in Hawaii who received that false text message about an intercontinental missile that was going to land in 90 minutes. Like this whole island of Hawaii freaked out. The physiological response was real. Like it was terrifying, and she's still traumatized from that experience. But that's sort of what happens with exosomes, is that in some cases, the body that's actually producing them is so sick that the recipient might get information that's a bit off. And they may be so sick that when they detoxify, it's similar to what happens with benzodiazepine and ethanol withdrawal. You can die. That's because they're so sick, their detoxification pathways are so distorted that they can't even undergo the necessary rite of passage to have a healthy influenza response. And that gives you an idea of why it's true that, yes, in some cases, it appears as if a invisible particle went from person A to person B and it killed them. So it's not to take away from the fact that xenohormesis and the xenogen explanation doesn't have potentially severe consequences, because that's how sick we are. Most of us know it's a miracle that we're alive every day and feel relatively good, considering everything that we're being assaulted by every given minute. I mean, I'm in a condo. There's probably 100 Wi-Fi signals that I live with every single day, and somehow I have the resilience to continue forward healthy. That's the thing, is if we reshift our focus on the infinite miracle that our body is and start to understand things like the scalar interferometry of our actual brain and what we can do in terms of, instantaneous, lossless communication around the universe, including telekinetic effects. I mean, this is the stuff that our human technology is so beyond belief. I mean, that's also why if we all get into coherence, and we can do things like steer hurricanes away from having devastating effects, and we could, create world peace. I mean, this is all real as far as I understand it from the new biophysics. But that's also why there's such a power around people misunderstanding what viruses are, what the actual nature of pathogenicity is. And I do think that this Xenogen hypothesis, as I've described it, gives us a middle path in understanding how, yeah, absolutely, there are no viruses, in the sense that there's no such thing as a piece of nucleic acid, encompassed by some proteins and lipids that's going to go from point A to point B. They're obligate parasites at best. They don't self-replicate. The cells choose. So in 2014, they did the first viron architecture study of influenza. It's an incredible study. They found that depending on the host cell, insect, chicken, human, up to 50% of the viron architecture is actually, the particle that's, carrying the influenza genetic material is from the host. So it's chicken lipids and protein, or human lipids and protein, meaning influenza isn't even other. It's half the thing that we say it's infecting. So in other words, viruses, exosomes, apoptotic bodies, extracellular vesicles generally, and there's a galaxy of them around our cells and in our aura, are actually there so our body can continue to be the miracle that it is and communicate with every other body on the planet and communicate with the other kingdoms of life. It's a beautiful thing. And of course, we know about the virome and the holobiont, which is, 99% of the genetic material contributed to our body is actually from the mycome, virome, the microbiome. So it's not even eukaryotic material. I mean, we are just a sea of otherness. So it's an incredible moment to be living, to be aware of all this information, and to be able to deconstruct and to take the energy out of the weaponization of germ theory as a political weapon. Because even when it came to Hitler, and Vera, you're here, is amazing. He said, "I'm the Robert Koch of politics," and when he was describing eliminating the vermin, the virus of the Jews, he understood that that's what germ theory was best at doing, which is to basically destroy others. And it's a veiled form of collectivism, and the greater good being really a form of aggressive communism, essentially. It has nothing to do with biology. It is just absolutely dark ages level stuff. And that's what we saw deployed. So it's no wonder, I can only imagine how many people actually died from the mRNA jab, but I think we're in the hundreds of millions when you really look at the VAERS data and the passive capture rate, as we all know. So there's more to it. I'm actually considering writing a book just on this topic, or updating my original book, Regenerate, with Hay House, so that I can incorporate this information, because I feel like it will help us to better navigate the realities of our incarnation, and once again help to keep them from using it as a weapon against us. So I guess I'll just open up to questions, since it's a complex topic.
I'm stopping recording. Sayer, thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. I'm sure we won't be able to ask all of the questions that we want, but I just wanted to start. Does your book Regenerate cover some of this? Because it is complex, and I would love to, to learn to sort of read it more. Does it cover it to some extent?
It does actually. It was one of the primary discoveries I think that I was most excited about but what I didn't do is I did not address directly vaccination or, I mean, because I didn't even get into even, this autoantibodies and natural autoimmunity and the function of the recombinatorial immune system, the humoral immune system to modulate gene expression, which is one of the things that it's designed to do in real time. So all these ways that we've looked at our own body as a source of disease or as it's all now being rewritten. And so GreenMedInfo, actually, I did put that in there. I did talk about natural autoimmunity. And when it comes to exosomes, I did discuss it in depth. But it's more about understanding the magic and marvel of the spiral of life and the way in which certain foods, I'll give you a quick example. This is my favorite. Uh, the mammalian ovary is replaceable by the fruiting berry of the pomegranate bush. It's actually an ovary. And if you slice the pomegranate in half, it looks like a mammalian ovary and it has bioidentical steroidal hormones, including estrogen and testosterone. And in the ovarectomy-induced model of menopause, all these animals, obviously they're depressed and they lose their bone mass and they start to have all the symptoms of rapid aging. You give one group, pomegranate, it's as if you never took their ovary out. And that's
Wow.
why, yeah, right. And throughout cultures, it was known to be the ultimate fertility, longevity
Yeah.
medicine. Not to mention, can remove plaque buildup in your carotid artery, like 30% within a matter of 6 weeks, just drinking the. So, and this is the law or the doctrine of signatures, right? Where God, the cosmos, nature's winking at us that the thing that looks like you should consume for a specific tissue, it actually helps that tissue. Flaxseed, the mucilaginous flaxseed is like an epithelial cell. It's essential for epithelial cancers like prostate and breast in terms of prevention and treatment. You just can't make the stuff up. I mean, walnuts, I mean, you have no better example, but at least we know now where the mechanisms seem to be coming from, which is, of course, well, there's a love affair between angiosperms and complex animal life, or Metazoa 2.0. But the mechanism that ties it together is actually these cross-kingdom messengers called exosomes, which are found in all our foods. And if we look as food as our information source and realize that we outsourced our genetic regulation and the optimized blueprint for health to certain foods, that's non-negotiable anymore. We have to eat certain foods in order to be healthy. Berries, for example, essential in order to be healthy. Like, okay, so cancer is not a deficiency of radiation and chemo, but it is a deficiency of certain information and compounds in things like berries. Like that's essential.
Sayer, can I ask you to take the slide down so that we can
Oh,
see
sorry.
everybody?
Yeah,
No, 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 no worries. And we'll start with some questions. That's great. James, go ahead.
I've only got one question, Sayer. Let's get connected at some point so we can have a longer conversation. I'd love to talk to you more, but I'm going to try like hell to limit myself to what I want to say, just to add to the conversation. 25 years ago or so, I read a book by Michael Tierra, and there's one line buried in the middle of the book, and he said the Chinese view of the five flavors. He said, well, if you don't get those flavors in your food, you're going to tend to attract people who have those flavors.
yeah.
And I swear, I started staying away from sugar and eating more bitter, and I attracted sweeter people. So that's one.
Love it.
Louise Hay's book, if you're familiar, Heal Your Body, influenza, the probable cause of influenza, um, response to mass negativity and beliefs, fear, belief in statistics.
Mm.
Her new thought pattern is I am beyond group beliefs or the calendar. I am free from all congestion. And the last word says it all, influence.
Wow. Wow.
People have influenza.
Yeah.
Okay? Um, in terms of COVID and the virus and all that sort of stuff, I have been of the belief for several decades, everything that you just said, that these particles, call them what you want, are informational transfer packets. I think I learned 25 years ago that bacteria can transfer, genes and such. With COVID, people didn't die from the virus. They died from their body's response to whatever they were dealing with. And so my take on it, my working theory, is that those people who cannot handle and do not want and will violently fight against new information
Mhm.
suffer more.
Mhm.
Um,
So
what I
let's hear.
think is going on with the jabs, when I saw that Canada ordered 400 million jabs for 40 million people, it's kind of like an allergy desensitization. The people who are getting all these jabs, are being desensitized to spike protein, which will then be generating forever, damaging their bodies slowly, creating lifelong customers for big pharma. And last but not least, boy, is my pomegranate tree very, very pregnant right now.
Excellent. That's great.
Do you want to comment on that, Sarah? Should we go on?
Yeah, just I love what you shared. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Sherry.
Thank you. You said you used a term, if that was, excuse me, and I didn't understand what it meant. Passive capture rate when it came to the mortality of the COVID jab. Could you explain what that means?
Sorry, yeah, I just meant the post-marketing surveillance system has approximately a 1% or less capture rate for the acute reactions to the mRNA jabs in all vaccines, which is astounding, right? Because there's 2.6 million there now. So you have to really bring it to 99-fold higher to get a real sense of the actual damage. And that's in the US population, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm like, that's almost 200 and what, 50 million acute uh, side effects that happened or main effects. That's just insane because the chronic is even, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So pretty much everyone who received it was devastated as far as I'm concerned. Lucky to be
Thank you.
young.
I totally get it. I just didn't know
Yeah,
the
yes.
label.
Talk fast sometimes. So
Micah. Micah.
Had to get unmuted. Thank you.
Yeah,
I'll make
go
this
ahead.
quick. I have lots of questions, but I'll just ask a couple. Um, question about the exosomes and was you saying the exosomes shed?
mhm.
And if so, um, someone could you're saying that would explain how groups of people, say in an office situation, they'll all get sick at the same time, even though one person may have only had one person was exposed to toxins, a specific toxin gets sick, and then that person sheds their exosomes to the other people in the office and they can present the same symptoms.
Yeah, so there's like an aura of both bacteria and microparticles that are always being emitted, and exosomes are part of that. And every tissue produces them, and every especially liquid like tissue, like plasma, you're going to find it full of exosomes. So it's just another way of making it clear that when we think of viruses as being messengers of genetic information, basically exosomes are the same, and theoretically, yeah, they're there to help serve, the herd, if you will. So because again, we hate being sick, but it may be life-saving and essential for our health. And then, of course, many of us that go through a forced fast or detox because we had influenza, you feel great afterwards. But those people don't know what it's like to do intermittent fasting. They don't push themselves in workouts where they're close to death. Is that how you feel? And then you're super ecstatic. That's the beauty of it. And that's what our body needs. It needs eustress, good stress. And that's what we've lost. And so in many ways, influenza being a necessary rite of passage, often seasonal for sick, westernized populations, they don't really understand what it is. And yeah, it could be life-threatening because these people should be dead anyway. It's a miracle they're alive every day. That's one of
Oh,
the ways to look at it. Yeah.
Thanks,
Well,
Sarah.
the last question I have is a quick one. You told a story about the missile launch scare,
Yeah.
and that the person you knew actually got themselves sick from that.
Yeah, it was just an
And
example.
then you mentioned also coherence when you talked about referred to coherence of stopping storms, things like that. You know, if a group of people are very coherent together and one person gets just simply scared and makes themselves sick, and then they all get scared, can that coherence then present as sickness in everyone?
Yes, absolutely. I think that sometimes even they use the phrase what mass psychosis or wait mass whatever that phrase that Malone uses. That's one psychiatric example of it. But yeah, absolutely. I think that that is the reality of it, is that when enough people believe a certain thing and their body is undergoing a physiological response consistent with being sick, then yeah, it can manifest in that form. Oh, here's an example. See, it's so obvious sometimes I forget the obvious. When the cell is damaged, it will go through a process where often it will leak nucleic acids. PCR is the most insensitive of all technologies on the planet. People think it identifies a needle in a haystack. No, it takes a needle and synthetically amplifies it into a haystack, which is why Kary Mullis, who was actually tripping on LSD when he devised the technology, was trying to explain to people that it does not identify infectious particles. It's incapable of it. You can find anything you want with PCR. But the reality is when the cell is leaking nucleic acids into the plasma, for someone to claim that PCR is going to pick up a specific viral particle versus what's there, through our own genome is absurd. But that is why you have viral load, and that's why you get false positivity, and people, they go in, oh, I'm sick. Oh yeah, it's COVID. No, their cells are falling apart, right? And they're not clearing the debris effectively. But the particles that are emitted during that process through apoptosis and necrotic bodies, etc., are going to look a lot like viral particles. So, and that's why certain things, black seed. There's a study I published recently on GreenMedInfo where there was a 75% increase in surviving COVID-19 when given black seed with honey. Not a lot either. Doesn't mean that it's this profound antiviral. It's just that black seed has a restorative and protective effect on the cells, and they're less likely, for example, to leak nucleic acids into the blood. That's another way of looking at it,
See you in 2 weeks. Take care. Thanks again, Sarah. Bye.